Welcome to the Order of Revan. This is a place for all things Star Wars where we can discuss theories, shows, movies, games, you name it. And at the end of the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel to show your support. Conversations began to arise not long after The Mandalorian Season 1 started airing regarding the anomaly then known as the Child. We were all aware at the time that Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy resulted in failure, as shown to us in The Last Jedi, when a cowardly Luke tried to kill his own nephew for fear of his power, resulting in the deaths of most of his students and the defection of those not killed during Ben's rampage. As the child's Force sensitivity began to become apparent through Season 1, and then his eventual training by Luke Skywalker at the end of Season 2, the question asked more than ever was, why isn't the child even mentioned in the sequel trilogy? Theories about Disney retconning their own sequels have been around for quite a while. Those theories became more prominent and more developed as Season 2 of The Mandalorian aired. And when the Season 2 finale gave us the mic drop of all mic drops, it was apparent that Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni weren't simply introducing subtle inconsistencies with the sequel trilogy. No, they were actually following canon, while I would argue that the Disney sequels now outright contradict that canon. So what's the issue, you might be asking? Well, allow me to state my thesis. Disney's sequel trilogy contradicts canon and cannot exist per the events established before it. This was never true, however, until The Mandalorian Season 2, as the series seems to create issues with the sequel trilogy. And now that the sequels are contradictory, it's the sequels that need to be removed from the timeline. So while the sequel retcon theory does make sense to me and contains points I agree with, I am actually taking it a step further by pointing out that the sequels don't merely exist in another timeline, but that they can't exist altogether. Alternatively, if they are allowed to exist, they exist without the events of Star Wars Rebels as a part of their history. Of course, you then have to wonder how the original trilogy would be affected by the absence of the events of Rebels, and whether the sequel events would therefore play out as they did. Either way, the sequels can't exist within the canon and are therefore already retconned. Allow me to explain the major points that make this apparent. In Charles Soule's The Rise of Kylo Ren comic series, it's established that Ben Solo was Luke's first apprentice, not Grogu, taken in to be trained at the age of 10. Ben, at this point in The Mandalorian, would only be a few years old, so Grogu, the child, precedes Ben's training by roughly 6 years. This blatantly contradicts what has been established by the Rise of Kylo Ren comic series. So to me, it is apparent that the seemingly contradictory story created by The Mandalorian is no small thing. It's worth noting that the Luke we got in the sequel trilogy is already altered by the events of The Mandalorian Season 2 and cannot exist as we saw him in The Last Jedi, as that Luke was contingent upon an entirely different history altogether. And so it begs the question, what sets off the chain of events to lead us to this point? The sequel retcon theory has always revolved around one key plot point from Star Wars Rebels, the Veil of the Force, otherwise known as the World Between Worlds. The Veil of the Force is essentially a dimension of the Force connecting all of space and time. In Season 4 of Star Wars Rebels, Ezra enters the Veil of the Force. While there, one of the portals reveals to him Ahsoka and Darth Vader's encounter on Malachor from Season 2, where Ahsoka dies. Ezra would reach into the portal and grab Ahsoka, pulling her into the veil before she would die. With Ahsoka now alive, she could influence current events, whereas previously she was never alive to affect them. Because Ahsoka lived, Bo-Katan was able to lead Din and Grogu to Ahsoka. Ahsoka then led them to Tython, where Grogu could use the Seeing Stone to reach out to any remaining Jedi since Ahsoka did not want to be responsible for Grogu's training. Because Grogu reached out through the Force, Luke Skywalker was able to locate him after he was captured by the Empire. Luke was then able to take Grogu for training. Essentially, the events that led us to the end of Rise of Skywalker were the result of Ahsoka's death. We know Grogu's blood is like gold to the remnant of the Empire, who seek to use it to clone Force-sensitive beings and even create them from scratch, entities known as Strandcasts. Snoke is one such Force-sensitive Strandcast, and we even see the other copies of him on Exegol at the beginning of The Rise of Skywalker. This means the remnant of the Empire was able to harvest enough blood from Grogu to continue their process for decades, something they could only do if Grogu had been alive and in their captivity for quite some time. But didn't Din Djarin and his crew rescue Grogu? Well, they did, but only because Luke Skywalker appeared to destroy the Dark Troopers. And why did Luke appear? Because Grogu reached out to him while on the Seeing Stone on Tython. And why did Din and Grogu make it to Tython to begin with? Because Ahsoka told them to go there. You see, Ahsoka's presence set off a chain of events that led to Grogu escaping captivity. Sure, the remnant of the Empire did capture him while on Tython, and they did harvest some more blood from him. But if Ahsoka had never sent them to Tython in the first place, Moff Gideon would have just tracked them down elsewhere, Luke never would have been contacted, and Din and his crew would have been slaughtered by the Dark Troopers with no Luke there to save them. With Din and his crew killed, no one could have staged another attempt to save Grogu. He would have remained with the Empire to have his blood harvested for potentially decades, assuming the Empire wouldn't just kill him off once they had enough blood to replicate their experiments. Ahsoka was alive to bring about the events that would ultimately save Grogu. Whereas her voice was once heard by Rey at the end of Rise of Skywalker, proof of her death and return to the Force, Ahsoka is now very much alive several years after what would have been her death on Malachor during Rebels Season 2. So what does this really mean for the sequels? Does this mean they are simply contradicted and no longer exist in canon? In my opinion, yes. If we subscribe to the idea of multiple timelines, then at best the sequels simply exist in the timeline in which not even Star Wars Rebels takes place, making it a timeline completely foreign to established canon. You see, some would have you believe it's as simple as Ahsoka living in one timeline, and then dying in another. But it's more than that. The events of The Mandalorian are part of a history that is no longer compatible with the sequel era. I don't believe the sequels are even in a different timeline at this point. I believe they are erased from the timeline altogether. It's obvious that Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni are using the canon established by Rebels, which is compatible with the prequels and the original trilogy. And the mere existence of Ahsoka does not allow for the sequels to even exist in their current form. This was all started by bringing Ahsoka back, and the mere fact of Luke taking in Grogu as his first apprentice, not Ben Solo, puts the final nail in the coffin of the sequel trilogy. The Ahsoka series will not dive into retconning the sequels as some would have you think. This has already been done, and it was done the moment The Mandalorian aired. It's likely the effects of this will be felt when Kathleen Kennedy's time at Lucasfilm has come to an end. But what do you think? Tell me in the comments below if any of this makes sense to you and if you're excited about the idea or find it unappealing. And if you liked what you saw here, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more Star Wars content.